Chapter 2. The Girl from Montana. March 2nd, 2086. Detroit, Michigan. Inez was very upset when her boss followed through on his threat the following day. To cover the cost of the computer and hologram emitter smashed during yesterday's fight, Inez was made to forfeit her next paycheck in its entirety. She had half a mind to just quit her job on the spot and walk out of Binary Fusion, but reality quickly sank in. There just weren't many jobs left in Detroit, and unemployed people quickly became homeless. After that, it was all downhill from there. Sure, there were other ways to make money, but Inez strongly preferred the relative safety of Binary Fusion to the rest of the city. Entertaining clients via hologram was as safe as can be, and if someone wanted a physical encounter with Inez, bringing them into the binary warehouse was far safer than going with the client to some unknown location where anything could go wrong. So she stayed and spent the daylight hours working the holobooth, entertaining men and women from as far away as Barnard's Star and Polaris. Normally, clients would only come to the building for physical encounters during the evening or night hours. While there were some exceptions to this rule, there were none today. Without pay, Inez was being used as slave labor for a week, but that didn't mean she was going to be miserable the whole time. She still enjoyed her work, and simply decided to put more effort into having fun with her clients rather than trying to separate them from their money. Around noon, Inez slipped out of her holochamber for lunch and caught her friend Opal, who was walking across the street to get food from a restaurant. Brothels, be they holographic or peddling the real deal, are the subject of very intense attention, so for their own safety, Inez and Opal referred to one another by their aliases. "Steph, wait up!" Inez caught the door just before it closed behind Opal. "Hey, Lynn, are you doing all right?" Opal hugged Inez and pulled her into line behind the deli counter. "Did the boss really dock your pay?" "Yeah, he did," Inez admitted, "so I'm going to be eating smaller lunches for a week or so." Opal shook her head. "Nuh-uh, I'm buying for you." The two women started to haggle over whether Inez was going to pay for her own food, and only stopped when the chef behind the counter presented 2 sandwiches for them, wrapped in to-go bags. On the front of the packaging, the insignia of the old Advent Burger store was poorly covered up with white tape. "So, Lynn, I'm being serious now," Opal said in a lower voice. "How are you going to pay rent and buy food? Do you need help? 'Cause I owe you after yesterday." Inez tried to scoff and wave off Opal's offer of assistance, but her friend persisted. Out of the restaurant, across the street, and through Binary Fusion's lobby, Opal persisted. Finally, Inez relented. Fine. You can pay my rent," she grumbled. "But I get to do something for you in return, okay? How about I cook dinner for you and your dad or something?" "Come over to my place," Opal suggested. "I told my dad a little about you before, but since yesterday, he's really wanted to meet you and say thanks." The rest of the afternoon went by in a very pleasant blur. Inez was looking forward to visiting Opal's home, and she threw herself into her work, quite literally. One holographic client after another materialized inside of Inez's holochamber to find a very gracious and energetic host waiting for them. The vast majority of Inez's clients were UN Army soldiers, far from home and looking for companionship. Today, anybody who contracted services from Inez would be left very satisfied. The soldiers kind of melted into each other, but a few clients did stand out. A high-ranking official completely forgot he was married once Inez was finished with him. She left him in a daze and he forgot to disconnect the hyperline. Inez smirked at him before cutting the connection. A wealthy businessman on Alpha Centauri nearly collapsed from overexertion and paid Inez a bonus for wearing him out. 2 soldiers, who purchased an hour of 3-way action with her, cleaned out their bank accounts, desperately trying to purchase an extra half hour with Inez. Then, around sunset, a military officer entered the warehouse and paid for the privilege of spending half an hour alone with Inez in a private room. Somehow, when she finished, Inez was even more energized than before. She was ready to clock out and get on with what promised to be a good evening. Finally, around 7 o'clock in the evening, about an hour before her shift ended, Inez finally tired herself out. Doing this sort of thing for 12 hours a day takes a toll on the body. The instant her latest client faded away, she slumped into a corner and took a deep breath. Inez nearly fell asleep then and there, not really caring that she still had an hour left on her shift. Hell, she wasn't being paid this week anyway, so she didn't really give a damn if the boss caught her slacking off with less than an hour left on the clock. She was just going to close her eyes for a few minutes and catch her breath. Beep, beep, beep. The hyperline was ringing. Inez groaned. It must be a client. Reluctantly, she clambered back to her feet, feeling much heavier and groggier than any other point today. Inez put on the best smile she could and tapped the touchscreen. "Good evening. My name's Lynn Potter." She introduced herself with her fake name and a cheerful tone. Looks like you've bought half an hour with me. So, what do you want to do?" With a flickering of lights, a humanoid shape took form in front of Inez. At the same time, the holochamber reconfigured her surroundings according to what the client wanted. Instinctively, Inez struck a seductive pose, making sure the plunging neckline of her shirt was in plain view. A second later, however, she felt a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach as she recognized the sight coming together in front of her. She was standing in the center of a large cathedral with a very high vaulted ceiling. In front of her, she saw a massive stained glass window that stood nearly 20 feet tall. On the glass was an image of Jericho, the girl who became a god, dressed in robes of white and gold. The blue star, known as Altair, was visible through the stained glass. At the altar, the yellow cross of XCOM had been repurposed into a religious symbol that adorned not just the altar, but also the pews, the flags, and even the insignia above Jericho's head in the window. And there was a man in front of Inez. He was dressed in green and black robes, with a thick black hood and a heavy blindfold that covered the upper half of his face, right down to the tip of his nose. Inez instantly recognized both the place and the man. She was warned about this. Everybody at Binary had been warned about these people. This place was the Cathedral of Jericho, and this man was one of her acolytes. Before Inez could even open her mouth to speak, the acolyte launched into a pre-prepared speech. "To sell yourself is an affront to Jericho. Save yourself now, here, in her grand cathedral where—" The acolyte never finished his speech. Inez disconnected the call and quickly blacklisted the cultist hyperline address, punching the button so hard she hurt her finger. Inez hated being shamed or judged for her line of work, and unfortunately that seemed to happen a lot. She'd long ago lost count of how many times random strangers had raised hell about Inez being a sex worker. Lots of folks told Inez she was being exploited and that she needed to be saved. She hated that message in particular. But Inez wasn't stupid. She knew that many of the young men and women who worked at Binary were genuinely at a low point in their lives and were probably being taken advantage of. But Inez didn't count herself among their number because she liked her job. Inez thoroughly enjoyed sex and everything to do with it. She did what she loved and loved getting paid to do it. Not like there was anywhere else to work in Detroit anyway. Angry and frustrated, Inez shut down her hyperwave terminal. She was so done for the night. A few hours after sundown, Inez and Opal clocked out and made their way to the parking lot, where Opal's father was waiting in an electric car. Once the two women got in the car, Opal's father turned to greet Inez. He was so old that Inez wondered if he had any memories of the old world. His age was confirmed by the yellow words on his baseball cap, which said, "Combat Veteran, Battle for Earth, July 20, 2035. Opal's father introduced himself while he powered on the car and started to drive. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Espinosa. My name is Montri Anward, and I guess I owe you quite a lot for sticking up for my Opal." Both Inez and Opal blushed. As it turns out, Opal's family lived in Novi, a small town on the outskirts of Detroit. Since it took some time to get there, Opal filled the time by explaining her own family to Inez, with a little help from Montri. Opal's father was almost 50 years older than her, yet he was married to a woman less than half his age. Opal was the youngest child of 6, and all of her siblings were only half relations, as the only thing she had in common with them was Montri. Each of Opal's brothers and sisters had come from a different mother, with Montri being common father to all. Only 2 of the Anward mothers were still alive, and they lived with Montri and his children in Novi. The oldest member of the Anward family was Montri's father, who was Opal's grandfather. At just over 110 years old, the elder Anward spent most of his days wondering just how he had managed to live so long. Before Inez could ask for more details about Opal's grandfather, they arrived at the Anward home. Throughout the car ride, Opal had failed to mention the fact that her family was very poor. Not that Inez needed the reminder. The entire Anward family lived in a tiny, run-down house with only 3 bedrooms, all of which were too small for a family of 10. Trash piled up in the yard while paint peeled from the walls and vines grew unimpeded up the walls. At least one of the upstairs windows was broken. Every member of Opal's family was employed, except for her supercentenarian grandfather, and the money each person brought home was, when added together, just barely sufficient to keep lights on and food in the kitchen. The Anward family was surviving and not doing much else. When Opal, Montri, and Inez arrived, 2 of Opal's siblings ran out of the front door to greet them. They too had just come home from work. Opal's brother Flint worked in the docks on the riverbank, which meant he was dirty, musty, and tired out. Even so, Inez couldn't help but notice that Flint was suddenly aroused by the sight of her. He took every opportunity he could to look at Inez, with emphasis on gazing at her torso and legs. Inez felt flattered. Try as he might, Flint couldn't hide the fact that he was very strongly attracted to her. Opal's sister Ruby was also a prostitute. However, she did not work for Binary Fusion. Instead, Ruby physically met with real clients and did the real deed all the time. Ruby looked dangerously exhausted, but she still had the energy to grab Inez in a tight hug and say her thanks over and over again. Ruby took an instant liking to Inez. Inside, one of Opal's mothers was making dinner and had already set a place at the table for Inez. When she saw how small the serving sizes were, Inez realized that her own presence meant everybody else would be eating less tonight. "Oh, no, I can't," Inez tried to say. "I can't ask you to." "Nonsense, it's all right," replied Mrs. Anward. "We wanted to give you more, especially after Opal told us about you losing your pay, but she talked us down." More like shouted us down, I guess. If I had my way, you would have moved in and been part of the family. Seems right, after you saved my daughter. Opal's other mother doted on Inez, offering her refreshments and a pampering. You know, we really are grateful you saved our girl, said the other Mrs. Anward. If we can't get you to come and live with us, then perhaps you'd like to marry Opal instead? We could probably make that happen. Opal balled up her fists and stamped her feet. Mom, you're embarrassing me! Inez stammered but was spared from answering by the arrival of a frail old man. Opal's grandfather was so battered and worn out that he needed a wheelchair just to move. Yet when he reprimanded Opal's other mother, his voice suggested that he had plenty of strength left. Give the young lady some space, dear. She's a guest, not the kitten you found off the street. Then Opal's grandfather introduced himself. My name is Garth Anward, and I owe you my deepest thanks. We all knew that Opal and Ruby were in a dangerous line of work, and if I could have my way, they would both have other jobs. But we need the money, and there's nowhere else for them to earn cash. I'm so grateful you were there for my darling granddaughter. Please join us for dinner. We all want to know you better. I dare say even that some of us hope you'll extend your friendship to us as well. With a kind smile, Garth took Inez's hand and gently guided her to the dining table, where all but one member of Opal's family were slowly gathering for a meal. The only member of the Anward family who was absent was the oldest of Opal's siblings, a man named Garnet. He was employed as a security guard at the nearby UN Army base and wouldn't be home until long after midnight. Dinner itself was a small serving of hot chrysalid soup, served with a glass of treated water purchased from the local gene therapy clinic. Since the food went quickly, there was a lot of conversation. Everybody offered their thanks to Inez for saving Opal's life, and Garth insisted on using what little money his family had to help pay for Inez's rent until she started getting paychecks again. She tried to turn down the generous offer, but the entire Anward clan insisted until she relented. Think of it as my way of thanking you for looking out for Opal yesterday, Montry said. I'm sure once word gets back to them, your parents will be proud of you as well. Opal quickly waved her hands to get Montry's attention, but he didn't realize he'd misspoke until Inez's face fell. She looked down at the half-finished meal on the kitchen counter and mumbled some words of thanks. Montry noticed the change in Inez and turned to his daughter. Garth had also picked up on the sudden shift in Inez's mood and was giving her a quizzical look. Something I said? Montry asked. Before Opal could reply, Inez spoke. It's okay, really. There was no way you could have known. I asked Opal not to talk about it. All of this was true. In that moment, Inez could have gotten very angry with Montry for bringing up a subject that was implicitly forbidden, but she didn't. The fact that Montry didn't know Inez's past and had to be told was a sign that Opal was trustworthy. She had kept her friend's secret. Inez supposed there was no harm in sharing now. The Anward family had already offered to help, after all. With a deep breath, Inez started to explain. Opal already knows, Inez began, and I don't like to talk about this because it's so embarrassing, but here goes. My parents, they abandoned me here about 5 years ago. The reaction from everyone in the room was uniform in nature. There was an outpouring of sympathy for Inez and a small amount of anger directed at her parents, wherever they were. One of Opal's mothers refilled Inez's bowl of soup and pushed it to her. The rest hung on Inez's words with rapt attention. When I was younger, I lived with my parents in Bannack. It's a ghost town in Montana, over 1,000 miles from here. My dad's a scientist. He works for the UN government, and my mom was a field agent for the ISO. Opal's brother dropped his spoon. The Internal Security Office, Flint gasped. That's the UN spy agency. Your mother was a spy? Inez nodded. The three of us lived at a UN army base in Bannack. Dad was working on some secret project in a lab, and Mom was working for the security team. Didn't see her much. Almost never, really. My dad raised me. What's your father's name? Ruby interrupted. Emmanuel. Montry raised an eyebrow. I've heard that name, he replied. Professor Inez Espinosa. He's the leader of the whole science directorate now. Inez winced. Yeah. Her voice was strained. Before that, he took me into the lab every day. Got most of my education in there from other scientists. Dr. Spark was basically like my tutor. Spark? Montry repeated. I don't know that name. Polly Spark? Inez said. You probably wouldn't know her. She was new when I was there. So what happened? Opal's mother asked. How come you live here, alone? Inez's face darkened as she went on. Her voice cracked a few times from the effort to hold back tears. Well, I'm not too sure why it happened. It didn't make sense, she admitted. Ever since I was young, I was kinda different. My dad said I was special, and I believed him. Special? How? Montry pressed. Well, I could do things, Inez replied. There were other kids on the base, and we were all in like a sort of school together. And I remember that I always kinda knew how everyone else was feeling. Like an intuition. I didn't even have to look at someone's face, I just knew what kind of mood they were in. Empathy? Garth said. I know a few people. Not that kind of empathy. Inez stopped him. I'm not reading minds. It's not the gift. It's more like a strong gut feeling. Intuition. Opal nudged her father. She's guessed what I was feeling loads of times, Opal said. You can't hide anything from her. She probably dialed us in as soon as she came through the door. Opal was right. In fact, looking around the table, Inez quickly sized up everyone in the room. Opal felt embarrassed by her family's obsession with Inez and was looking for a place to hide. Ruby was desperate for some sleep, but she was putting up a front until dinner was over. Flint was not paying attention to the story. He was busy fantasizing about sleeping with Inez. Both of Opal's mothers were worried about Inez's mental health. Montry was fascinated by Inez's story, and his curiosity about her past was overriding his own physical attraction to her. Garth was genuinely concerned for Inez, and she felt her own heart get warm and light when she realized that. On hearing Opal's comment, Flint's eyes went wide. Then his cheeks flushed as he mumbled, I didn't mean to. Inez waved her hands. No offense taken. You're not the first person to react that way. She continued her story. I told my dad about I guess you can call it empathy. He said I would grow up to be something really special. He said that a lot as I got older, especially after my first fight. Fight? Montry asked. There were a lot of kids in the lab, Inez sighed. Kids fight a lot, especially when the adults aren't looking. Thing is, nobody ever taught me how to defend myself, and I've never worked out before, not once. But whenever someone comes at me, I can't really explain it. I just kind of know what to do. I don't think, I just do. That's what happened with Opal yesterday. That guy should have killed me, or at least put me in the hospital. He was bigger and stronger than me, but in the moment I just knew what to do, and I did it. Montri and Garth stared at Inez with open mouths. Before they could think of something to say, Inez pressed on. But there was one other thing that made me believe my dad. Made me believe he was right about being special. After I hit puberty, I started, attracting people. Romantically and, physically. I think I was 10 years old the first time a guy older than my dad started hitting on me. Inez shuddered, reliving a very unpleasant memory. Flint looked like he'd just been pulled out of a daze. It got really bad really quickly. Men, women, boys, girls. Suddenly, everybody wanted to be with me. Everyone called me the most beautiful girl in Bannock and started making up excuses to give me things and be with me. Even some of the bullies I beat up were trying to get in my pants. I couldn't hang out with teenagers at all. They couldn't control themselves. Some of the adults were really bad too. Everyone wanted me and it was all so awful. There was this one guy, a teen who liked to bully me, David Sepulveda. When he started to like me, Inez stopped talking, tears running down her face. Opal gently took Inez's hand and stared intently into her face, as if inviting Inez to read her emotions. Inez quickly picked up on her friend's show of support and began to tell the final part of her tale. It was right after my 16th birthday. Dad came back from the lab, all excited and happy. He said that my mom got a promotion, that she was moving up in the ISO. Montri grumbled. Well, if your father is Professor Espinosa, then your mother is Scarlett Freeman. She's the ISO leader now. Why the hell would they have left you out here if they were doing so well for themselves? I'm getting there, Inez cut him off. Just listen. After I turned 16, Mom asked me to follow her into a part of the lab I'd never seen before. It was a dark place with purple lights and 2 cells, kind of like cells in a prison, on the far wall. Mom took me into one of the cells and put a weird machine on me. She put something on my arm and on my head. And then she told me that I was going to take a test. Like a test of my brain, of my mind. She said that I needed to sit in the cell with this weird thing on me for a few hours. All I had to do was sit there and have normal thoughts. She smiled at me. I remember that. And she said she expected me to do just fine. Inez took a deep breath and shuddered. Reliving this memory seemed to be distressing her. Opal's eyes were starting to fill with tears. She'd heard this story before and didn't want to relive the ending. Inez pressed on while the Anwards watched with rapt attention. When it was over, Dr. Spark pulled the machine off me and said I could go. I looked for my mom on the way out, and I saw her. She looked so disappointed. I knew I failed. Whatever that test was supposed to be, I failed it completely. She gave me this glare, like I'd broken her heart. And that was the last time I ever saw my mom. The next morning, Dad told me I was moving away. He said it was time for me to learn how to live on my own. He brought me here, to Detroit and my apartment. Then he arranged for my rent to be paid by his government agency. Dad... Inez sniffled. She was about to cry. He said he'd check up on me in a year, and then left. I had to fend for myself in a city I didn't know anything about. I was so scared all the time, and I just kind of shut myself in my apartment and prayed for the day when Dad would come back, but... Montree's mouth fell open. He was figuring out the rest of the story on his own. You were 16? And you're 21 now, he said. That means you've been in Detroit for 5 years and... Oh my goodness, you were here the last 2 times the city fell. Inez nodded. I was getting money every month from Mom and Dad to pay for the apartment and for my food. But you know what happened? The warlords came, and you probably saw. Flint nodded. I was there. The Americans pillaged the banks. The money stopped, Inez confirmed. I ran to the bank and begged them to help, but all they could do was give me the hyperline address for the Bannack base. I called and called and called, but no one ever answered. I called the UN Science Directorate, tried to get through to Dad, but nobody could help. They kept telling me that I had the wrong clearance, or that they couldn't help because I was outside UN territory. I got desperate. When winter came, I waited until the Detroit River froze, and then I tried to walk across to Canada. Ruby gasped. But how? The city was locked down, she said. Yeah, I found that out the hard way, Inez scoffed. Men on snowmobiles came and dragged me back to Detroit and arrested me for vagrancy. Judge told me to get a job and pay my rent, or he'd throw me in prison. And that's how you met me, Opal chimed in. We started working for Binary, Inez said with a smile. I won't lie, I kinda liked it. I know I have an effect on men, and at least I was getting paid for using it. It was fun. Montree frowned. So, what did you do when the UN retook the city 2 years ago? I nearly died, Inez laughed. I was out shopping when they started shelling the city. You know the food market on Jefferson Avenue? The one that used to be an Advent burger? Me and a dozen others holed up in a meat locker until the fighting stopped. The store even got hit once. Something exploded in the parking lot and blew out all the windows. As soon as the Americans surrendered, I ran back to my apartment and stayed there until Binary Fusion sent someone to force me to go back to work. I remember that, Opal said. The boss told him to break down your front door. Inez rolled her eyes. Anyway, once the UN took the city back, I started trying to call my dad again, and I got the same stupid runaround. You're not cleared for that communication. We don't have your data in our records. Please respect the sensitive nature of the directorate. All crap. In the end, I just gave up. My parents don't want to see me. They don't even want to talk to me. So screw them. This is what they wanted anyway, right? I'm out here, making my own way now. Opal and Montree both raised their bowls and said, Damn right!